Hello and welcome to Woman Inherits the Earth, a mother-daughter podcast about the representation of women in movies and television. I am Tess Adair, a writer and the author of the paranormal mystery series The Karanzan Chronicles, and Beth's daughter.
And I am Beth Von Baron, Tessa's mother and also a writer. In this podcast, we talk about movies and television that feature women as the leading characters or where the story focuses on women or women's issues. Our discussions will also touch on roles available to women, how men have dominated the film industry since its beginnings, and whether or not that is changing. Today we are discussing Little Women. The movie version that is directed by Greta Gerwig was made in 2019, running time of 2 hours and 15 minutes, produced by Columbia Pictures and Regency, written for the screen and directed by Greta Gerwig, and that is her actual credit. Instead of giving her a separate credit for writing, they put it all together. And that's because it's a famous book written by somebody else. So it's based on the novel by Louisa May Alcott, produced by Amy Pascal, Denise Zinovi, and Robin Swicord. Amy Pascal was listed first, so I think she was the primary producer. Director of photography is Yorick Lisseau, which is a very interesting name. Production designer is Jess Gonchor, and I don't know if Jess is a man or a woman. The editor is Nick Huey, Houy, I don't know how to pronounce that. And music is by Alexandra Desplat. Costume designer is Jacqueline Duran. So there are quite a few women in the production of this. The main actor is, can you pronounce her first name for me?
Saoirse
You know what? I'm going to write that down. Saoirse Ronan, Emma Watson, Florence Pugh, Eliza Scanlon. They play the sisters. Laura Dern is the mother. The men are Timothy Chalamet, Tracy Letts, Bob Odenkirk.
I think it's Chalamet.
Is it Chalamet? And there's 2 E's on Timothy. So
yes, it's French through and through.
French through and through. Bob Odenkirk, James Norton, great actor, love him. Doesn't get a lot of screen time in this, but he's really good. Louis Garrel, Jane Hadishell, Chris Cooper. I almost didn't recognize. I'm looking at his face, and he's got this makeup, and his hair is gray and kind of bushy, and beard, and I'm thinking, I know this guy, and I had to look him up. That's a good actor. Anyway, and of course Meryl Streep.
Did he play Mr. Lawrence?
Yes,
the older
he's
Mr.
the
Lawrence?
uncle
Okay.
to Laurie.
Okay, yeah, I think it's his grandfather.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's a very sympathetic character in this movie, and I think probably the most sympathetic male character in the movie.
Yeah, for sure.
Very likable.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just looked him up, and I did have this feeling the whole movie that I recognized him, but I couldn't quite make out his face. And yeah, now that I'm seeing him without the makeup for the movie, I've seen a bunch of stuff.
And I couldn't even tell you what else he's been in, because he just kind of he's a name I always remember, and I always recognize him, but I don't remember the movies that he's been in, which says to me that he's a very good actor, because he's just a character actor. He's not a star, but anybody who knows movies knows who Chris Cooper is. He's one of those kind of like Bob Odenkirk. I mean, Bob Odenkirk is up until his starring role, or his in Breaking Bad, and then Better Call Saul, was one of those character actors who showed up periodically and stuff, and he was amazing.
Although I think Bob Odenkirk also had, he was a character actor, but he also has a background in kind of more obscure comedy.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. He was in this sketch comedy show with David Cross called Mr. Show with Bob and David,
which I
think it's kind of like a cult show. Mm-hmm. It has a small but loyal following. So prior to Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, Bob Odenkirk was known by some people for that. But yeah, apart from that, he was mostly a character actor.
And, before we get into the summary, which Tess is going to do, I would say just point out that the reason we are doing this movie today is because it is directed by Greta Gerwig, and we had just discussed Barbie a couple of weeks ago, and so we're kind of on a Greta Gerwig kick. But I also, as I was watching this movie, I realized that the birth of Barbie is in this movie. There are a couple of scenes where the women talk about how disenfranchised they are in so many ways. There's
Yeah.
one scene in particular, where I think it's actually Amy who was not our most
Yes.
thoughtful character. I mean, she can be, but she has a good scene where she talks about how she, even if she had her own money, she wouldn't own them when she got married. If she has children,
Yep.
they won't be hers; they'll be her husband's. So there's foreshadowing, Barbie foreshadowing in this movie.
There's several monologues
Mm-hmm.
that sort of feel like precursors to the Gloria
Yeah,
monologue,
they
for
do.
sure.
They absolutely do.
Yeah.
So anyway, do you want to give a kind of summary of the story for the very small
Yeah.
percentage of people out there who don't know this story?
Yeah, so I feel like Little Women is one of those stories where I feel like I've just always known the major plot points. I know I did watch the Winona Ryder version in the 90s, but I don't think I rewatched it that much. It's just I feel like it's one of those movies, or it's one of those stories rather, that has been around so long and it has such a. I mean, it's been remade like or it's been made into a movie like 4 times. There's a silent movie
Right.
version
I
of
think
it.
there's at least 4. Yeah, there might be a TV made for TV version too. So there might be
Possibly.
5. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's a thing where like I don't think I watched it that many times. I don't think I was that into it. I'm sure I saw it once because I have memories of it, but I feel like a big part of my ability to remember it as well as I do, because I knew kind of all of the plot points as they were coming up, is just because it's kind of this cultural touchstone. Everyone knows about Little Women, especially considering that there are so few stories that are about women that are considered classic literature and are written by women.
Yeah.
Because of that, it kind of has this outsized place in our culture.
So have you read the book?
No.
No, neither have I. And I think that's something to say to our listeners.
Yeah.
Is that neither one of us has read the book. And I will tell you that I have never had a shred of interest in reading this book. I understand that it is written by a woman and it is about 4 women, but it's set in a period in history that I have no interest in reading fiction about unless it's much more dramatic. This is, what do you call that? It's a domicile type of story. I mean, it's just a story about these women in their homes and with their families and their whatever. There's a name for it.
It's a bit of a Bildungsroman because it's about all of them coming of age.
It is a coming of age story, yeah. And I see the appeal for actresses, 4 main character roles. And how often does that happen in a movie for women, that there are 4, characters that they can sink their teeth into? Each one of them is very interesting in her own right and has her own story to tell and could be its own novel, each one of them. But at the same time, I am sick to death of this story.
Yeah. Yeah, so I should actually talk a little bit about what the story is. I mean, the story essentially is the 4 characters. So there's the mother, who is known as Marmee by the girls, and then there's Meg, Joe, Amy, and Beth. And I'm not sure, so I know Meg is always the oldest and Joe is the second oldest. I feel like in the 90s version, Amy was actually the youngest and Beth was a little bit older than Amy.
I assumed Joe was the oldest, so I don't know.
No, I'm pretty sure Meg is the oldest.
Okay.
But in this version, they seem to have aged Amy up a little bit. She doesn't seem as much younger as she did. Because in the 90s version, Kirsten Dunst played Amy, and she's much younger. I rewatched the trailer for it on Amazon. It wasn't really a trailer so much as just a random scene from the movie, but Amy in that version is very young. This version, they seem like they're much closer in age. The plot of the story is basically just these girls going through their lives. Meg is the oldest and kind of the most traditional of the girls. Her actual desires are really just to be a wife and a mother. She wants to have a family. Joe is kind of the actual main character and arguably the author insert. She wants to be a writer. She chafes pretty hard against the restrictions on her gender during the time period. She doesn't say this, but she kind of wants to be a man. She wants to have the freedom of a man.
Yeah, she's a rebel.
She very much wants to make her mark on the world, and not in a traditional feminine way. Amy is actually very similar to Joe. She also really wants to make her mark on the world, except her passion is drawing and painting instead of writing. And Joe is very confident in her abilities for most of the story. Amy doesn't really have the same level of confidence, probably partly because she's the younger sister, and from her perspective, my personal take is I think Joe is kind of the star of the family, and so Amy feels constantly outshined by
and
Joe.
she does. She says it. I always get her I'm second always, she says.
Yes,
Yeah.
she's always second to Joe. And then there's Beth, who is kind of the sickly one. Is largely
she's a throwaway character.
Her characterization.
She's a object of love for them and compassion, but she has no real personality.
Yeah, she is good at playing the piano, but she doesn't really want to do it in public. She's very shy about it. And, you know, I feel like in this time period, most wealthy families had to have at least one person who could play an instrument, because that's the only way you could listen to music, right?
It was entertainment at parties, yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty common for especially young women to learn an instrument, because how else are you going to entertain yourselves?
Yeah.
So she is the musician, but she's not really driven by that. She's very quiet. I mean, I think her characterization is supposed to be that she's the kindest one, because she's the one who wants to help the poor family nearby way more than the other girls do, apart from her mother. Her mother also does. And this is also ultimately what gets Beth killed. By the way, spoilers.
I'm shaking my head here, and Tessa's looking at me because I'm shaking my head, because that is one of my sticking points with the story, is that the mother, and we'll get to hot takes on this, but she literally causes her child's death. This is part of the story that drives me crazy. But anyway, go ahead.
I mean, it is a little bit annoying that it feels like Beth is this sort of angelic character whose angelicness gets her killed, and it also kind of robs her of any interesting personality.
Yeah, but you know what? The actress in this version pulls it off really well. I
think so. I think all of
they
the
all
actors
do. Yeah, I was never bored by Beth's performance, and that's saying something, I think.
I was actually going to say, I think Emma Watson does an incredible job as Meg, because my memory is that Meg is like kind of the least interesting and most forgettable character, but in this one she kind of wasn't. Emma Watson really made her a bit more likable. It really felt like in this version she's still not my favorite character, but I felt much more of a connection to her, and much more like I actually liked her. And I feel like that is a credit to Emma Watson's performance. Emma Watson puts a lot of pathos into her performance as Meg.
Yeah.
Since I mentioned favorite characters, I feel like that's the big thing with Little Women, is like everyone's got their favorite character.
And for you and me, I can't speak for you, but I kind of assume, how is it ever not going to be Joe?
No, it's not Joe for me. It's Amy.
I love really?
Amy. Okay. Fuck Joe.
Oh man, okay.
Amy is my favorite character, but I do feel like I'm supposed to like Joe.
And we're both writers, and she is, to me, she is the symbol of creativity in the film.
But she's so selfish.
Well, I don't have a problem with her being selfish. I have a problem with her mother being selfless to the point where she puts her own child at risk. Scarlet fever. Scarlet fever is nothing to laugh at, and it kills her. And she literally sends her off to take care of a sick family, while their mother, and I'm not going to use her name, because Marmee is stupid. It's a stupid name. I'm sorry.
You can call her Laura Dern.
I love Laura Dern, but I don't like this character. She does a good job with it, though. I mean, she does a much better job than Susan Sarandon did. It's really hard to make it not a sappy character, and Laura Dern does give her a little bit of nobility, but it's written into the character, because there's just not a whole lot you can do with somebody who is so devoted to her sense of duty that she gives away their Christmas breakfast. And it's not like they're wealthy. Yeah. It's not like they're wealthy. It's like you're giving away something that is a real treat for these girls. You're giving it away without, it's just, it's ridiculous. And I understand about charity. I'm a very charitable person, but I wouldn't give away money or food that I needed to feed my own children. Yeah. If you're wealthy, you can do that. If you're not wealthy, you can't do that. And that's something you have to accept. She cannot accept it. She is so bound by her sense of duty and her need to be charitable. And I don't know where this comes from, but it's ridiculous, and it makes me sick.
It's kind of implied that the father is the same way, right? Because he wasn't drafted into the army. He volunteered, and I think he's just a pastor.
He's a chaplain.
So he volunteered to go be a chaplain for the army. Like, are you even helping that much? Like, well, my partner and I were watching it, and at first we were theorizing that he was a doctor, and then it kind of made sense that he was going to the front line. But then he finally shows up, and he's a chaplain. So he volunteered to go be a chaplain for the army because he just so wanted to, quote unquote, do the right thing. But meanwhile, he left his wife and 4 children alone
for themselves
for years.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And also, how did he lose his money? It's written into the story, the novel, that he has lost his fortune. How did he do that?
Yeah.
How did he lose his
Unclear.
money? We don't have any information on that.
Maybe he gave it away.
Maybe he gave it away. And you know what?
Yeah.
His sister is not wrong. When she says
Yep.
that he failed, she is not wrong. Both of these parents, I see them as good, well-intentioned failures. But the girls are not. The girls are resilient, but it doesn't matter how resilient you are. Scarlet fever can be deadly if you don't have antibiotics,
Yes.
and they didn't. Sorry, the mother just really drives me crazy.
The parents are frustrating, and I feel like a big part of what's frustrating about them is that the novel thinks that they're right.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the novel presents them as angelic.
Yes.
And I feel like that actually speaks to my broader problem with the whole story. My partner and I were talking about this, and we were both trying to figure out why both of us are big fans of Jane Austen, but don't like this story that much. And eventually, I think I figured out for me what the difference is. Jane Austen was very critical of her main characters. She wrote stories to be incisive and to be commentary on social class, but also on different personality types. You know, I mean, take Emma, for example. The whole point of that novel is that Emma is way too proud and way too sure of herself and kind of needs to realize that she's not always right. In this novel, you do have characters who have flaws, but it feels like the writer doesn't get that they're flaws. Like, I think Jo is an incredibly flawed character, but I don't think Louisa May Alcott thinks she was a flawed character. I think Louisa May Alcott thinks that Jo is always right.
Because I think Jo is the only good character in the story. I don't like Amy the way you like her. I think she is...
I don't like Jo.
Well, there you go.
And actually, let's go back a little bit, because there was something that I wanted to talk about. You know, maybe part of my issue with Jo...
Jo leaves New York and comes back to take care of her sick sister. Would Amy have done that?
Amy isn't given the choice, and that's a problem that I have with this story. I think it's incredibly cruel that they don't tell Amy what's going on, and based on the way that they're talking, yes, she would have. They intentionally do not tell Amy that her sister is dying, and not only do they not let her say goodbye to her sister, they don't even tell her in time for her to come back for the funeral. Amy misses out on everything.
When Jo... Oh, it is at the end. You're right. It is when she's in New York. You're right.
I think we should probably try to get back on track.
That's actually a very good point, but also communication between the United States and Europe during that time might have taken months to get to her.
There are several lines of dialogue where they state that this comes up multiple times, where they state that they are intentionally not telling Amy because, quote, Beth doesn't want to ruin her trip. And I don't really think that was Beth's decision to make. I think this is an incredibly cruel thing that they did to Amy. That is my personal take. As someone who recently lost someone, I would have been incredibly pissed if everyone else around me knew that he was dying and didn't tell me and didn't give me the chance to say goodbye. I think that's super cruel.
I remember that now, and I remember thinking, no, you really need to let her know so she can make a choice. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, whether or not she could have gotten home in time is another question. So, because it is a long
She might
voyage,
not have, but they could have given her the chance, and they didn't. Mm-hmm. And this is speaks to my overall issue with this story, is that I feel like it has some of these characters make these decisions that are not good, but the story has no interest in questioning them, because, you know, Amy comes back and they just kind of gloss over all of it. Like, she's devastated, but she's not mad at them for taking away this opportunity. And maybe that's partly because she knew that there was a chance that she wouldn't get back, but it just feels like there are so many instances where we don't really interrogate what people are doing, because I think Louisa May Alcott didn't really want to. She wanted to write a nice story about nice characters who do nice things, and even though they don't always actually do nice things, the narrative kind of treats it like they are. And I think that's part of why I'm not that interested in this story.
Family relationships are complicated. Sibling relationships are complicated. One thing we didn't mention is that Amy marries Laurie before they come home.
Yes.
Which doesn't give Jo the opportunity to tell Laurie that she's changed her mind. So that's another thing Amy does. Now, Amy doesn't know.
She already turned him down.
People change their minds. But, I mean, I don't hold that against Amy, but I think it is another thing that she does, and she is very happy about it. She isn't just happy to marry Laurie. She is happy to have something that well, first she says she doesn't want him because he's a cast off of Joe, but she's loved him forever. So when
I think she's always been in love with him.
and yeah, so when she marries him, I think it's kind of a stab at Joe. I think there's a resentfulness
I think that's
there.
your interpretation.
Okay.
I think she's always been in love with Laurie.
Well, yeah,
and
she
that
says
is
that.
her real.
But yeah, she says that. Yeah,
because she could have married the other guy. The other guy was wealthier. Fred Vaughn. I don't know why I remember that name out of all of them, but the guy who was courting her in Europe. She could have married him. He was wealthier, but she's always been in love with Laurie. I don't know why. I don't like Laurie very much as a character.
I don't know why anybody would be in love with him. Yeah.
But I wanted to go back to the beginning because we should talk a little bit about the way that Greta Gerwig has structured this. I do think it's interesting, especially, for a story that everyone is so familiar with. Greta Gerwig kind of made a decision to tell it out of sequence, and she's doing something really interesting with the coloring. Some of the scenes are in like bright, super saturated colors, and then some of them are in slightly muted, more cool tone colors. Those scenes are typically the ones that are not quite as happy, but also for most of the story, those are like the present day scenes are the sort of muted colors.
And see, the thing, she's not very, I think it is an interesting idea what she did with it, but she gets a little sloppy with it. When we
I agree, it gets a little weird.
Yeah, when we start off the book came in two parts. The original book that was published, and the first part sets it all up, and the second part kind of resolves everything. So we're starting off at the beginning of this movie version in the second part, but then she flashes back to earlier scenes that are in the first part. At first it works, but then she gets sloppy with it, and I think because she's cutting back and forth really quickly, and all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, where are we now? Where are we in time?
Yeah, I do think that gets a little bit difficult to parse. My interpretation is that for the last roughly 15 minutes of the movie, the stuff that's happening in the like sunny, happy lighting is not real and is a part of the book. That's what it seems like to me, because it kind of seems like that stuff and the darker colored stuff are not really happening on the same timeline, because the darker colored stuff is where Jo goes to the publisher and eventually gets her full book published. And the stuff that's happening in the bright colored stuff is where she gets back together with Frederick and they get married and they start a school for boys. It kind of feels like those are maybe two different stories.
You mentioned the coloring. There were a couple of scenes, and I can't remember, this might have been right after Beth dies, but the coloring that she opens with is orange, kind of like there's a storm on the horizon orange. And I thought that was pretty effective.
Yeah, I do think it was effective, but I also think that the part where Beth dies is where it starts to get a little confusing.
It is. It's very, she's cutting back and forth too much, or too quickly.
Yeah. Well, and between things that are too similar, because she's cutting back and there's Beth's sick in the present and Beth's sick in the past.
Yes, exactly.
And she's cutting back and forth between the two of them, and in the past, Beth survives, and in the present, she doesn't. It's just, that's the point where it starts to get confusing for me, and I feel like that's maybe also the point where it feels like things change and the brightly colored stuff is no longer the past and is instead the novel.
Yeah. And I think the coloring is a good way to do it, changing the color back and forth. And I kind of like the idea of starting later in the story in part 2 and then flashing back to part 1, but you can't cut back and forth like she did in the last third of the movie. So it's too much. So that's one structural issue I think I have with the movie. The other structural issue is that at the end of the movie, when Frederick comes back, and actually this is a problem I have with the whole movie. Did she cut out some of the flashbacks that she meant to use? Because Frederick comes back and they're all lovey-dovey and he asks her to marry him and they're going to get married, and it's like, you left on really bad terms, but also in the flashbacks, it's not obvious that they have, they do some things together, but it's not obvious that they have a romantic relationship. When it's more like he's a professional relationship, and he reads her stories that she's been publishing with Mr. Dashwood and says these are terrible. And she says, but it's what people want to read. And he says, but you don't have to write like that. You can write better. They'll want to read that too. And then that's it. She leaves after that to go back. As far as we know, we don't really know, because there's so little time spent with Frederick. And I do remember in the version in the 90s with Susan Sarandon, it is Gabriel. Wait a minute.
Gabriel Byrne?
Yes, yes, yes. It's Gabriel Byrne.
My memory of that movie is that in that movie the professor is way older than her. That was my interpretation when I was a kid.
Well, and he's supposed to be, I think.
I think so.
You're talking about Frederick.
Yeah, Frederick. Yeah.
I think
Whatever
he
it
is supposed to be 10 to 15 years older than her. And Gabriel Byrne, I think, is in the 90s. He's my age, so he would have been in his 40s. And who played Joe?
Winona Ryder.
Oh yeah, so he would have been easily
Much
double
older,
her
yeah.
age. Yeah. So they don't establish enough of a romantic relationship for them for when he comes back at the end.
I think that's intentional.
You do? Okay. I didn't like
because
it.
my interpretation is that him coming back in the end, none of that's real. I think that's what she wrote for her novel, because the conversation that she has with the publisher, and I guess we should establish this a little bit.
I didn't understand what you were saying. You're saying that's not actually happening in the story?
I'm saying none of that happened. Or at least that's my interpretation. I think you could interpret it multiple ways, but my interpretation is I agree with everything you just said. I think they did not really establish her relationship with Frederick as romantic. It doesn't feel like it's gotten enough set up at all. That's part of why I think that none of that really happened in the real world version of what happened.
And the flashbacks are happening while he's reading the novel, and she's sitting there and he's reading it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, she came up with this ending to please her publisher, so all of that romantic stuff at the end with Frederick is in the novel that she wrote. It's not part of this story. It's not part of her actual story.
And not part of the movie story. But I think in the original book, and the other versions of the movie, they do get together. But what happens is that he goes off to, and he doesn't go to California to teach. He goes off to the Western lands, quote unquote, to make enough money so he can come back and support her. So they're opening the school at the end. Do you think that's in the novel or that's reality?
I think that's in the novel. I think her real ending is just getting that book published. This is my interpretation, and I think Greta Gerwig is being a little meta about it, because there has long been debate about why Jo gets married in the book when she has spent the whole book saying that she never wants to get married. Mm-hmm. And not only does she get married, but she gets married to the guy that nobody wants her to get with, because everybody wants her to get with Laurie. And, even in versions where I think Greta Gerwig has intentionally cut down how much time Frederick has, but even in versions where he has more time, I don't know a lot of people who are happy with her ending up with Frederick at the end. Maybe there are some, but my impression has always been that nobody really likes who Jo ends up with, and I think Greta Gerwig has come up with a kind of solution for that where you can interpret it my way or you can't. So my way, Jo never gets married. She's just a writer, and she lives her own life.
And at the end of the second part, the second book, they don't get married. I don't think. Yeah. I think he goes off to California to make.
But there was a sequel, wasn't there? I think the stuff where they...
There were she wrote a lot of stories, and some of them might have been sequels, but I was reading the Wikipedia page, and I think he goes off with the intention of coming back. The goal is that they're engaged, I guess. And he will come back once he's made his fortune, quote unquote. I don't know how he's going to do that as a teacher, but yeah, that's what he's supposed to do. But then in the Wikipedia page, they also jump to the next part of the story, which is that she inherits Aunt March's house and opens the school. So that is in the novel.
So I think we should maybe jump back a little bit. I mean, again, I'm hoping that anyone listening to this has seen the movie, and certainly that most people are going to be aware of the story anyway. But I do want to talk about how the movie begins, because I think it partly explains why I don't really connect with Jo that much as a character. And to be fair, I have this problem pretty often with fictional representations of writers, because I always feel like most fictional representations of writers, they go one way or the other. They're either way too depressed and downtrodden, or things happen way too easily for them. And I feel like Jo is in that second category. And it begins with the first scene where we open up with Jo walking into a newspaper office and immediately getting her story in the paper.
For she does say that $20. He gives her $20. Now, we have to assume that's dollars, right? That's a lot of money. Yeah. That's a lot of money for a story.
It
back
is
then.
less. They do make the point that it's less than he normally pays, which is probably because she's a
She's a
woman. He
woman.
says that they normally pay 25 to
30.
30, so he gives her 20, so it is less, but it is a lot of money. That's I mean, later on
That's enough for
they say
that would
that
pay her rent for the month.
exactly, and probably still have some left over to
And
send to
she's
her
an
family.
unknown
It's
writer. She just
yes.
walks in off the street, and she doesn't even. She tells him it's for a friend. I'm submitting this for a friend, and she doesn't even say the friend is male. She says my friend
My
my
female
woman
friend,
friend. Yeah.
and he sees through that
Yeah, of
immediately. Like
course.
it's very clear that he knows that it's her. Like it's not a good cover story. It's
So why?
clearly
Why did
like
she do this? I don't understand
I
the
think
need.
she's maybe a little bit embarrassed. Like
Mm.
she kind of doesn't want. Yeah, I mean I understand that a little bit because I understand. It can be very, very hard to share your writing with somebody for the first
Oh
time,
yeah.
and that's basically what she's doing. So I think that's her way of giving herself a little out. So, if he hates it, then she doesn't have to be completely embarrassed. She can
And she
just,
is embarrassed by the nature of the writing too, because
yes.
they are stories that are kind of slightly scandalous or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not really what she wants to write, but she has to make a
Yeah.
living. And that's why she doesn't want her name on it. She doesn't want to byline. She doesn't want a story
Yeah.
credit.
It sounds like the part that he cuts out is the part that she wrote to try to ease her conscience over what she was writing,
Mm-hmm.
because she says something about like she wanted her sinners to repent or something,
Yeah.
and that's the page that he cuts out. I will say, like, I like a lot of that scene, in part because I kind of love the publisher is named Mr. Dashwood. I kind of love him as a character. Like, he's not a good guy necessarily, but he is hilarious.
He's great. Yeah.
So I do like that aspect of the scene. But as someone who like is a writer and lives in the present day and has submitted stories, it is just nowhere near that easy. Like it's tough for me to watch a movie that opens up with a scene where you're clearly supposed to empathize with Jo, and you're supposed to feel really bad that she's not getting paid as much as men, because they make a point of that, and you're supposed to feel like she's this underdog, and I'm just like, that is so much easier than it is to be a writer today. If she had done that today, she would have been fucking laughed out. Like she would have had to.
I did not feel sorry for her at all, because and when he says
Yeah.
25 to 30, I'll give you 20. I'm sitting there thinking, I'm surprised he didn't give her 5 because she's a
Yeah.
woman. So no, 20 was pretty good.
I'm just sitting there fuming that she got it published at all.
Oh yeah, see.
I'm just like, this lucky little bitch.
And it was an unrealistic scene for me too, and that's why, because I think realistically, if she had walked in as a woman offering another woman's work, and he had said, we usually pay 25 to 30, I'll give her 5
Mm-hmm.
because she's a woman, that would have been realistic. But to say he was
Yeah.
going to give her 20, which is 2/3 of what their maximum pay
Yeah.
is, that's pretty good. And
Yeah.
the whole thing with her getting published after him just reading and just getting an appointment with him, walking in the door
Yeah.
and sitting down
Just
and
walking
getting
in the
him
door
to
and he's
read her
immediately
stuff.
available.
Yeah. That the whole thing was kind of unrealistic.
It's a
Although
fantasy.
I
Yeah.
do think that Alcott, that's how she made her living. She wrote stories for newspapers.
I will say, like, part of this is how much writing has changed, because it is true that in the 1800s it was more similar to that, just because
Mm-hmm.
there was not nearly as much competition.
Right.
We're talking about a time where people had to hand write everything.
And
no one even had typewriters.
And literacy was an issue. So
Yeah. But at the same time, there were enough literate people that people were buying magazines. This is
Mhm.
largely how Charles Dickens made his living. He would sell he would sell his stories to magazines, and they would come out every week.
Mhm.
That's also part of why Charles Dickens' stories are so incredibly verbose,
Yep.
because he got paid by the word.
Yeah.
So the more words, the better. But, these magazines would come out every week. People didn't have television. The magazines were, their main form of entertainment. So these publishers were hungry for content
Mhm.
and didn't necessarily care as much about that content. So to an extent, I do think this is somewhat realistic in that, like, if she had been a man, this would have been a completely realistic scene.
Mhm.
But yeah, I do think it's a little bit weird that he didn't lowball her more than that, especially since it was the first time.
Mhm.
It'd be one thing if she slowly got him to pay her more. But anyway, so part of my jealousy is just the fact that it used to be so much easier to get published. because not as many people were literate. You had to write it all by hand, so it was a physically much harder process. Publishing has changed so much in the last 50 years. It is just a completely different beast than it was at that time.
That's a good segue into what I think one of the themes of the movie is, and that is that it is a book, and in a way, it is a book about writing, about creativity, about the life of the mind versus the life of commerce, which is what the other choices are here. It's set in a time when both men and women conferred importance on artistry, and everybody, women learn to play the piano, even men, because Frederick comes back and plays the piano for them. So, and somebody says, and I have a note here about this, somebody says writing doesn't confer importance, it reflects it.
Amy says that. Yeah. Or wait, no, sorry. Joe says that, but then Amy responds with...
Well, the quote is, writing doesn't confer importance, it reflects it. And I'm not sure what that means.
But then Amy says, you make it important by writing about it.
Oh, okay. It's conferring importance.
Yeah, what you said is what Joe says is kind of a debate that they're having.
Yeah.
And I do think that, to me, I do think that the core of the movie is the debate between Amy and Joe. Mm-hmm. Because I think Joe, in some ways... I think she's a much more masculine character, and Amy is a much more feminine character. I think Amy embraces parts of her femininity that Joe doesn't, and I think in kind of an extension of that, even though Joe really does not like her place as a woman, in a lot of other ways, she has really absorbed the common ideas of the time, including the idea that something is only important if people are already writing about it. That it's not her place to decide what's important, and that's why she doesn't want to write about women. Whereas Amy's take is, but you can make it important by writing about it. And so in some ways, Amy's perspective is a little bit more radical, and part of that is because she's a little bit more feminine and more interested in feminine things.
She's more practical, too. She understands that money runs the world. And she says, I always knew I would marry for money. And she gets what she wants, I think, except for Beth. And maybe Beth gets what she wants, too. Because that's actually a different...
To die.
Well, because she's such an introvert, she doesn't really want to participate in life. She's always drawing back. I think she's okay with dying, which is a terrible thing to say about a character, but it does feel like she is absolutely accepting of her fate because she is so afraid to go out into the world. So, of course, she's the one who dies young. But I think they all three get what they want. Meg gets the marriage and kids. Amy gets the wealthy marriage. And at the end of the movie, and this is my favorite scene in the movie, she is standing there watching them print and bind her book. And I thought, that's like giving birth. It's just, it's an amazing scene. And Greta gets it. She realizes that this is her baby. And she's getting to watch it being put together lovingly by these craftsmen who, make each book individually back when they could, when there was time to do that. And it's a really beautiful scene when she's standing there in the window and watching them put her book together. And that's her
baby. Yeah. So I want to explain why Amy is my favorite character in a way that doesn't really have to do with her it does have to do with her relationship with Joe, but it's not really about their actions.
I will just interrupt you real quickly and say, I don't love any of these characters. I struggled with Amy because I thought she was self-absorbed, and you see Joe as self-absorbed, and she probably is. But I relate to that more. I related to her self-absorption more than I did to Amy's.
See, I related to Amy's more because I think Joe is really self-confident in a way that Amy isn't. Amy never feels like she's good enough.
But
and
why?
I relate to
why
that.
Why is that? And the thing is, in that one scene that I think what you're talking about here is where she throws her paintbrushes down and said, I'm done. She says, I'm never going to be great, so there's no point in trying. And to me, that's a terrible work ethic, because any artist worth their salt will tell you that you don't get great by giving up. You get great by plowing on.
But that's not the beginning of her story. She's already been at it for a long time.
No, this is in Paris, so wherever they are in Europe. I don't know where they are.
Yes, and at that point, she's already been an artist for a long time. She was an artist as a child. She's been working on her craft for a very long time.
Did you notice the painting that she's looking at when she decides? The previous scene, there are two scenes where she's painting as an adult, so I didn't mean to interrupt you. But the two scenes, one is when she's with our other artists and they're painting The Luncheon on the Grass by Edouard Manet. And I thought, well, is Manet standing next to her? And that's what she's upset. And then you look over and no, the guy next to her is painting it exactly the way she painted it.
Okay, and
So
I should have rewatched the scene to be sure, but I think she's actually painting it much more realistically, and
and
the other person
dynamically,
is painting
hers is more
Yeah.
dynamic as a painting.
But I think that wasn't the style at the time, is the thing. I think the other guy is doing something that's more similar to Impressionism, and she's doing hyper-realism with a ton of detail. I thought her painting was by far the more beautiful.
Okay, so
But
what year is this book set? Do we know?
roughly the Civil War.
Okay, Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, 1862. It's a very famous painting. We'll just insert this really quickly here. It's funny that she chooses that one because it's considered by many people to be the birth of modern art. He inspired the Impressionists, who then, created the beginnings of modern art. And it was his painting, Luncheon on the Grass. And it's 1862, and it was an infamous painting at that time. Not necessarily a well-liked one or well-loved one because it's bizarre. He's got these two men on a blanket with a naked woman laying next to him. So when in the picture that she's painting, in the painting that she's painting, and the guy's standing next to her, and I guess they're in a class or something. But the paintings, their versions, the woman is dressed. But in Manet's version, she's naked. So, but there is no version of that on display there in that scene, and I'm not sure that they could have been aware of it.
I think I don't know that they're supposed to be painting that exact painting, because they're painting there are actual people in front of them posing.
I know. The whole thing doesn't make sense to me. It's like, what is this, just a throwaway scene? Oh, ha, look at this, isn't it cute? Or is there a meaning behind it? And, is she saying that this is actually, I don't know. It was a confusing scene for me.
My initial interpretation of that scene was that Amy was in a class, and when she looked over and saw that the other guy's painting wasn't nearly as detailed as hers, that it was an indication that the class is kind of pointless to her because she's already moved beyond it. But then based on the stuff that happens later, I'm not sure that that was correct. I am a little bit confused about that scene, but I wanted to talk about, Amy from the beginning and kind of through her journey, because I think her journey is very similar to Jo's, but it's different in some key ways. What I've always related to about her is that, to me, in some ways, her experience feels a lot more realistic to life because, like I said, Jo, she walks into this publishing office and she immediately gets published. Even if she never got another story published after that, that's a really great and energizing start.
And she does it because she's not afraid to do it. Because
she's not afraid to do it, but also she doesn't hit the same amount of resistance.
Yeah, that's true.
That you would have in reality. This is only her third publisher that she's tried, and she gets it published, and then she can pretty much regularly get her stuff published there. She's kind of immediately successful, and this is often my issue when writers are depicted in fiction, is that it usually gets depicted as this thing where all the writer has to do is figure out their emotional problems, and once they do that and they find their true passion work, they'll create something that's immediately so amazing that nobody will be able to deny it, and they'll become a bestseller and they'll live happily ever after. And that's just not how it works. That's not at all how it works. First of all, your passion project is often not the thing that gets you big. That's usually the thing that only your real fans know about. Your passion project is often your least successful work. And writing is not about just having passion. It's a skill that you need to hone over time.
Yes, it's work. And it's hard work.
And none of these stories ever represent that. We don't really see Jo learning to write. We see that she does write, but it sort of feels like everything that she writes, except for that one scene with Frederick, everyone loves it and fawns over her.
Well, and I think that's because she can write what they want her to write. She doesn't.
Yes.
She wants to write something else, but she can't sell that.
She is writing entertaining things. If that's what she sees getting published, then that's what she's going to write. And that, to an extent, makes sense. It's just the only scene where she gets any pushback is the scene with Frederick. And even that scene, she's really offended by what he says, but again, I am a person who has been in a lot of critique circles, and what he said was not that bad. It was actually pretty nice, because basically what he said is, I think you're brilliant, but you're spending your time on stuff that is not worth your while. That's incredibly positive feedback to get, and she is so offended by it that she ends their friendship on the spot.
But see, the thing is, it doesn't make any sense to me, that scene, because why doesn't she come back to him and say, I understand this and I know it, but I have to support my family and this is what I'm doing? Why doesn't she say that to him? And,
yeah, I don't know.
Does she do it in the novel? That's another question. But it seems unrealistic to me that Jo, she does not, and maybe Greta is like you and doesn't really like Jo. Because she's inconsistent with how
I have wondered.
Yeah, she's inconsistent with how she presents her. I don't think that, I mean, she responds to criticism from other people much more favorably than she did with Frederick. I don't know why she doesn't say to him, I understand what you're saying. I have to keep doing this, but maybe you can help me with the writing that I don't sell to this magazine.
But this is part of my point, is she doesn't really get much criticism from other people. The only other criticism that she gets is from her publisher, who is very upfront about the fact that all he wants is that he's not really criticizing her. He's criticizing whether or not she's written to market. That's it. That's kind of his only criteria, is, have you written something that I know people will read? And the only time he really criticizes her is when she sends him the first couple of chapters of Little Women, and he basically just says, I don't see there being a market for this, and then is immediately proven wrong as
by his daughters find that's a great scene,
his daughters find the chapters and go crazy over it and demand that he publish the book. And that's Jo's happy ending. But getting back to Amy for a second, her experience to me feels a lot more like what most artists actually go through, where, you have this period when she's younger, she makes drawings for her friends, and her friends love it, and they think she's so talented. And then she gets in trouble for it because she's making fun of their teacher or whatever. But, when she's younger and she steps outside of the family, we never really see anyone in the family praising Amy's art skills. But outside of the family, she does get this praise from her friends, and that kind of gives her enough of a belief that maybe she can be something bigger, that, she does decide that she wants to go to Paris at some point and take lessons. But then that's kind of all she ever really gets. Once she gets there to Paris, there's nowhere really for her to go. I think Amy's story, and it's not that explicit, but I think Amy's story gets at a part of sexism that is not as on the surface, where you create this piece of art, and the feedback that you get isn't, you're a woman so it's bad. You just get, oh, you're not really a genius. And you get that over and over and over again. And the reality is, people have already decided you're not a genius because you're a woman. You're just hearing, you're not a genius. And that gets to you over time. Because even if they've already assumed I'm not a genius because I'm a woman, you're just going to hear the you're not a genius over and over and over again.
I understand that,
and it
but
chips away
I don't think that's in the movie. I don't think she's hearing that from people.
I don't think it's that explicit, but I feel like that is what I take from it.
I think
when she says that she's not a genius.
That she's not a genius. This is my take on Amy. I think she's a spoiled brat. And I think she assumed that because she's pretty and she's, she's charismatic, that she is a good artist. I mean, the artwork that they show of her, the work that she completes, is fine. It's very good. But to be better at it, she has to work at it. And I don't think she wants to work at it. It could be because she feels that nobody has ever praised her the way they did praise Jo. You may be absolutely right about that. There's a certain level of, being the younger child and not feeling like anybody supports her. That may be feeding her insecurities. But I do think she's insecure, but she's also unwilling. She says, if it can't be perfect, if it can't be great, I don't want to do it. Really? Is it?
I have had that feeling. I have absolutely had that feeling. If I can't be great, then it's not worth it, because I'm going to put all of this time and effort into it and nobody's going to care. I absolutely identify with that feeling. I think that is such a real feeling. That doesn't mean that that's where you end. But that is absolutely the feeling of being an artist, and this is part of my problem with Jo, is that she never struggles with that feeling. And I think that is absolutely a part of being an artist, that feeling that you're not good enough. And this is why I think I can't ultimately identify with Jo. It's not about ending on that feeling. It's not about giving up. It's about the fact that every artist at some point or another in reality questions whether or not they're good enough and whether or not it's worth it for them to do this.
I do agree with that, but I also agree with Kurt Vonnegut, who said even if you never make a penny off of your work, off of your writing, off of your art, off of whatever it is you do that is creative, you should do it. Everybody should be creative. And so when I see Amy giving up and saying, if I'm not going to be great, I'm not going to do it, to me, that's not a true artistic statement. It might be something that you would do in a moment and then come back to it if you were a true artist. But she acts like she's never going to come back to it. And we don't actually see her go back to her art. Maybe she does, but we don't see it.
Yes, we do.
In the school.
She says that before. She says that before we see her do another drawing of Timothée Chalamet. Now, we don't see a ton of her doing art after that because I don't think the story cares about her that much. The story really cares about Jo.
Well, Jo is the main character. I mean, she's the main character in the novels, too.
Okay, I do agree that I feel like Amy's story is to some extent unresolved because I don't think we get back to her artistry.
I don't think she gets back to it. And maybe that's
I mean, I think that's your interpretation.
But I think it's Greta's interpretation. I don't think she sees Amy's art as being important to her life, which is...
I don't think Louisa May Alcott
and
sees
that may
Amy's
be true
art
as well.
as being important. I suspect that Greta Gerwig might like Amy more than Louisa May Alcott did. I mean, she hired Florence Pugh, who is just one of the most likable actresses around today.
She's very good.
Extremely popular. And so I think Greta Gerwig has probably actually enhanced Amy's story from what it originally was. And for me, honestly, like, my favorite scenes are Amy's scenes, even though I don't like Laurie at all, which I feel like just goes to show exactly how likable Florence Pugh is, and also just how interested I am in Amy as a character. And, you know what?
You should write her story.
Oh, hard no. Hard pass. I don't write historical fiction. But I get what you're saying about Kurt Vonnegut's quote, but here's the thing. Amy has already produced art. So, like, I don't think Kurt Vonnegut's quote is a condemnation of her. She has already produced art. I think that qualifies her as an artist, even if she does quit, because she has already done it. And sometimes artists retire. And I don't,
not her age.
am not of the, no, true. But she's a woman who's expected to get married and have babies. And not only that, but we are at the point in the story when she marries Laurie, she has been told point blank by Aunt March that her two older sisters are a lost cause and it is her duty to get married to a rich guy so that she can support her family. That is what she has been told repeatedly and what she understands as her true value. I'm not saying I agree, I certainly don't, and I don't think that that should stop her from doing art, but I understand that pressure, and it's a pressure that a lot of female artists end up feeling. All artists feel a certain amount of insecurity, and I think it can be a lot worse for women who are often told in a million different ways that their art is never going to be that important and that their true value is to get married and have babies. And that can wear on you over time.
It can. I think you were seeing things in Amy that Alcott did not put there.
Yeah, she might not have, but I don't like her that much as a writer.
True. Same here. Amy's character is the one who is materialistic. She wants pretty dresses. She wants to go to parties. That's why she wants to go to the movie theater, or not the movie theater, the play. She wants to go see the play. She wants to go to Europe. She wants that life. She openly admits it. I always knew I would marry money. It's not just that she's got to take care of her family, but that she is. And I'm not saying that this as a I think it's condemnation of her at all. I'm just saying that's the way the character is written in the novel, and I think that's the way they portray. They don't actually. Gerwig doesn't actually write her that way in the movie as harshly, I think, as Alcott does in the novel. So she gives her the benefit of the doubt a little bit.
I think Gerwig has a lot more sympathy for Amy
I think
than
she
Louisa
does.
May Alcott
And I don't dislike Amy at all. I like her. I think, and that is probably attributable to...
You have called her a spoiled brat.
Well, the character is a spoiled brat, but Florence Pugh's depiction of her is beautiful. I mean, she's interesting. She's charismatic. She's smart. She's witty. She has the men that she's entertaining completely wrapped around her little finger. So she knows she's a very smart woman. She's a very capable woman. So when she says, if I can't be great, I don't want to do it, that is out of character to me, it seems like. Because she seems to me, I mean, she is a spoiled brat in her relationship with Joe, I think. But she does seem to come of age when she goes to Europe and finds herself. Why would she give up on her art at that point?
I think she's having a low moment. And I actually think that that's exactly the time that you would have the low moment, because she thought this was going to be like her paradise. She thought she was going to come to Paris and rule it. And, you know, everyone was going to see how brilliant she was, and she was going to have a great time and learn so much in these lessons. And instead she gets there and it's kind of the same as home. Nobody really cares about her. She isn't wowing anyone.
Except Laurie.
And
she does wow Laurie. And she does wow the other guy. What's the other guy say?
Yeah, she can wow men. She can get men to like her in a feminine way. Fred Vaughn is the other guy. She can use her feminine wiles and her beauty and her fashion and charisma to pull these men in. I think it's a combination of she is good at that, and also that is what society wants to reward her for.
When she makes the decision to give up on her art, I don't think she does that because other people are not noticing her art. I think she looks at her art and compares it to the guy next to her and decides in her own mind that she's not good enough. I don't see anybody telling her she's not a good enough artist.
We don't really have scenes where anyone talks about her art one way or the other. So I do think it's kind of left up to interpretation what's happening there. But I am seeing that because I identify with that.
Yeah.
Not in the same way, but I have also struggled in an artistic field where it's very hard to get any recognition, and it's very easy to feel like there's just no point. And I identify with that moment. So I want to say one last thing about Amy, which is that I think she also has my favorite speech. I think the speech where she talks about, you know, always knowing that she would marry rich and not being ashamed of that. I really like that speech. I think that speech is a good encapsulation of her character. You know, she does have this artistic desire, but she is also the pragmatist. I think out of the four siblings, I think she's the one who is the most practical and pragmatic about the world that they live in, and I appreciate her for that. And I think ultimately that's why Aunt March takes her with her to Paris instead of Joe. To Aunt March, from the beginning, she was pretty clear that she was only going to take one of them with her to Paris to get them married off, and it was very clear that Amy was the only one who was going to go along with that. Do I think that's fair? No. Aunt March is an interesting character for the kind of hypocrisy in her soul. I kept in my head kind of referring to her as the Phyllis Schlafly of the plot, because she's very concerned with telling these girls that they need to get married, but meanwhile, she herself is not married. And it's a very like, do as I say and not as I do kind of attitude.
Very much.
But on the other hand, she is also a lot more pragmatic than the girl's parents
She
are.
didn't lose her fortune.
And she's not wrong. It is true that none of them are going to have an easy time making their way in the world without a marriage, and that their best option is for one of them to marry rich. And luckily for all of them, Amy was on board with that plan.
And I think the other speech too, and I don't think it's the same one. Maybe it is.
Yeah, she's got like two.
Yeah, the other one where she talks about how she, and we mentioned this earlier in the program, that she knows that if she has even if she has her own money, it's not hers when she marries.
Yes.
When she has children with her husband, they are her husband's children, not hers. He owns her. He will own me. He will own our children. Sometimes the best you could hope for, if you were a woman with a certain intellect and a feeling of or a need for independence, like Joe has, sometimes the best you could hope for, and Jane Austen does a really good job of this, is marrying a man who understands what you need. Finding that man was probably a lot less possible and probably totally unrealistic, and yet somehow Austen thought it wasn't. But
well, Austen was writing at a time when women had an unusual amount of social power. This is one of the things about the Regency era, is among the landed gentry, there was so little to do that people became really obsessed with finding the right marriage and matchmaking between people, and that kind of changed the balance of power to be a little bit more egalitarian. And then Jane Austen came along and wrote her characters with as much agency as possible.
You know, there's something to be said for Amy understanding that in 1860 whatever, and it's certainly a precursor or foreshadowing of the speech in the Barbie movie, which Greta definitely has, you know, a certain point of view. in her
Yes.
movies. I think we should talk a little bit about the men. We've talked a lot about the women, and it
Hmm.
is the Little Women. And apparently the father calls them that, my Little Women. It just drives me crazy every time he says it. He
Yeah,
says
it's
it
gross.
twice, but I do like Mr. Lawrence, as played by Chris Cooper. He's the best male character. He is someone who cares about this family. He has lost his both of his children have died,
Yes.
and he was particularly devastated when his daughter died.
So it's I think she died young
Very young. Yeah, and the son lived long enough to have an heir.
to have
So,
a child.
yeah,
Yeah.
so Laurie is his heir. And so he attaches himself to this family when the mother gives their Christmas morning meal away to the very poor family. He sends them a lavish meal. How does he see? How does he know that they've done that? It's in the book too, so I don't.
I mean, I think they probably, because they live right next door, so I think
Yeah,
they probably saw them carrying their food.
maybe so. But anyway, so he sends them a lavish meal. He becomes attached to Beth, I guess, because she reminds him of his daughter. She comes to his house and plays the piano, and he gives her the piano eventually. But one time when she comes to play, I guess the first time, he is sitting on the steps. He doesn't let her see him. He's sitting on the steps listening to her. It's just such a sweet, sad scene. You really like him in that moment, and he's probably the
Yeah.
only male character I can say that about in the whole movie. Really liked him a lot. I never liked. He's clearly missing his daughter, and when Beth dies, they don't even want to tell him. I mean, it's just really it's almost like they're telling their father, because
What's important about that scene is he is actually doing her a favor
oh
by
yeah,
not letting her know that he's there, because she didn't want to admit that she wanted to play his piano at first because she doesn't want anyone to hear her. And when she finally agrees to come over and play the piano, she says, like, repeatedly, as long as you're sure I won't be disturbing you and no one will hear me.
mm-hmm.
So he clearly wants to hear the music, but he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
want her to be scared off, so he stays
He's a
out of
very
sight.
empathetic guy. He really
Yeah.
understands his family. He understands what they're going through. He understands that they have their pride, so he doesn't want to
Yeah.
do too much for them. So he just does enough that it's helpful, but it's also it's compassionate and loving kind of help.
He's also, at least in this version, kind of the story's main expression of the grief for Beth, because we don't really get long grieving scenes from, we see them go to the funeral and we see them cry a little bit, but kind of the most poignant scene about it is when Joe comes home, she sees him hanging out outside their house and not going in, and he tells her that he just can't bring himself to go in while Beth's not there.
Yeah, it's a wonderful relationship for Beth to have, because she is such an introvert. She doesn't go out into the world, and she has this relationship outside of her family. So that's really
Yes.
nice. An interesting thing about the grieving scenes, we hear them say that Aunt March has died, but we don't know when it happens, and
Yeah.
there's no funeral, and there is a funeral for
Yeah.
Beth. So it's like, okay, what happened to Aunt March? Well, she died and left me her house, but she was a kind of a prominent character. She wasn't in
Yeah,
a
I
lot
guess
of
nobody
scenes,
cared.
and we should point out that Meryl Streep plays this character.
Yes.
Does a very nice job, but it's almost like it's a throw off. I mean, she just this was an easy character for Meryl Streep to play.
She does a great job, but yeah, it's not like, for Meryl Streep, this is not a particularly nuanced character.
It wasn't a challenge at all.
But yeah, we find out because they're walking through her empty house that Joe has just inherited.
Yes,
And that's just
how we
that
find out that
died.
she's dead. Yes. Yeah.
Like, the only thing that mattered about her in the end was that she left Joe a house.
And the thing is, she does leave it to Joe, because she doesn't leave it to Amy, who, I mean, I think Joe is her favorite.
I mean, Amy doesn't need it.
Amy marries Laurie and will eventually get Mr. Lawrence's home. So Chris Cooper in Mr. Lawrence is my favorite character, and you wanted to talk about Laurie a little bit.
Well, first of all, I will just mention the dad is kind of a non-character, the girl's dad.
And that's true in every version of this movie.
Yeah. Bob Odenkirk is fine, but he barely exists. He does not seem important. Actually, when Beth dies, my partner and I were like, is the dad still here? Did the dad die off screen? And then you do see he is at the funeral, but he's like not there while Beth is dying. And there's no explanation because he should be back from the war at that point. So it's just kind of like, he's just sort of a non-entity. But Laurie, okay, so first of all, I should admit that I'm not a big fan of Timothée Chalamet.
I agree. Me neither.
He kind of creeps me out a little. It feels mean to say,
He's
but
too pretty.
It feels
he's too pretty.
I don't actually,
You don't
I
think
don't
he's pretty?
find him attractive.
Okay. I don't think he's attractive. He's too pretty.
My problem with him is that it feels like he has two facial expressions, and those facial
Yeah.
expressions are glower and leer. Every time he smiles, it feels fake.
He has a drunken scene, but I'm watching this drunken scene with him, and I'm like, he does not know what to do with his body. He's like,
Yeah, he's kind of goofy about his body.
He is not very flexible as an actor. You're right. It's like he does weird things with his body in the drunken scene.
But yeah, just every time he smiles, it feels manipulative to me, and I don't know why. And I'm so sorry to everyone who is a big fan of Timothée Chalamet. I know I'm in the minority. You and I are in the minority. He's a very popular actor, and he's done a lot of things, and other people like him. This is all subjective. I'm not a big fan of him as an actor, and I'm really not a big fan of Laurie as a character. He starts off okay when he first meets Joe in that first scene. Like, you kind of like him there because Joe kind of doesn't have anything to do at the ball, and the scene where they're dancing outside on the porch is very cute. I think part of the reason it works is that there's not a lot of dialogue, so it's all like physical stuff between the two of them, and I do think that Saoirse Ronan and Timothée Chalamet have pretty good chemistry. As much as I'm not a fan of Chalamet, I think the two of them have good chemistry together. Saoirse Ronan is very good at doing that kind of overjoyed expression with her body. That whole dancing and smiling scene, I think that scene really works. But after that, I mean, first of all, and you know, I don't think this is like a knock against his performance. I think it's how it's supposed to be. But every scene where Laurie is hanging out with all of the girls, it's like very clear that his attention is on Joe alone, and he's only putting up with these girls so that he can be around Joe. And that would make sense if that was like just initially, and then eventually he got to know the other girls better. But it feels to me ultimately disrespectful of what Joe is actually about. I feel like if he actually wanted to really be a good partner for Joe and thought it through, he would become real friends with her sisters, because her sisters are genuinely important to her. And he chooses not to because he's only interested in Joe. And this comes to a real head the moment where Laurie completely loses me is when he goes to the ball where Meg is, or the debutante ball. Meg has to go to the city at some point. I'm not sure exactly where she goes, but she leaves home and she has to be introduced to society at this debutante ball, and Laurie's surprise shows up there. She didn't know he was going to be there, so it's a surprise when he's there, and he tells her that they didn't tell her because it was meant to be a surprise. And then he proceeds to be just like unnecessarily mean to her and kind of ruins her night. He does eventually turn it around, but it's just like she's clearly excited to be there. And then he shows up, and again, he's doing the thing where like he says it was meant to be a surprise that I'm here, but as he says it, he's not smiling. He's just kind of glowering. He looks miserable. And you can tell immediately, like, as she sees him at first, she's, like, delightedly surprised. And then as he starts speaking and he's immediately bitter, you can see her face kind of fall. And then, I don't remember exactly how it goes, but he basically just tells her, like, he thinks all of this is stupid and he doesn't want to be there. And she asks if he likes her dress.
He insults her dress. Yeah.
And he says, no, like, I don't like fripperies or whatever. And it's just like, dude, why are you being so mean to Meg? I don't understand. Yeah. He just completely lost me as a character there, and he kind of never recovered, because he does the same thing or a similar thing to Amy. Amy invites him to another dance in France, and he agrees to pick her up and take her, and then apparently she waits for him for an hour. He never shows up, so she goes to the dance anyway, and then he shows up late
and drunk,
looking like a mess and completely drunk, and hanging off of two other girls. And it's just like, why did you agree then? Why did you agree to go to the dance with her if this is how you were going to behave? So yeah, well, I don't like Laurie.
Yeah, I agree with you about both Timothée Chalamet and the character. I don't like the character, but my least favorite character in the story and the movie is the mother. So do you want to go into hot takes?
Yeah, might as well. Yeah. Gosh, I'm not sure if I have. All right, so this is the time for us to talk about our hottest takes. I don't know that I have a very hot take about this, except that I just don't like this story that much.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm supposed to. Actually, you know what? No, my hottest take is that Jo is not my favorite character. I feel like Jo is supposed to be my favorite character. I think she's definitely Louisa May Alcott's character, and I think because I'm a writer, I'm supposed to see her as my favorite character, but she's not. Amy is my
Yeah.
favorite charter.
And you may be
I
alone
don't
in
know. Yeah.
that, by the way. I was just reading something else just quickly, and it said that that Amy is the worst March sister.
I mean, I definitely think Louisa May Alcott does not like
Yeah,
Amy,
I
and I
think
think
you're right.
historically, Amy has not been the favored character. I do think she is intended to be a bit of an antagonist for Jo.
But you identify with her, so.
I feel like in this version, Amy is just a much more emotionally resonant depiction of an artist. I am frustrated with the way that Amy's story ends, both because it feels like we just never get back to whether or not she ever continued to paint, and like she absolutely could have. And also, I don't like Laurie that much as a character, so even though she loves him, I kind of don't love her ending up with him, but, you know, whatever.
They're kind of perfect for each other,
she's
though.
happy.
I mean,
I do think that she's a better fit for him than Jo was,
Yeah.
because I think she won't let him be as much of an asshole as Jo would let him be.
I think so. And I identify with Jo more. I think she's more of a scrapper. And that's kind of what I've had to be my whole life. She doesn't give up. She keeps plugging away. And maybe it is unrealistic for her to walk into a newspaper office and get paid right away. But apparently that was Louise May Alcott's experience. She wrote for The Atlantic.
At the time, it wasn't as unrealistic.
Yeah.
I'm feeling like historical jealousy.
I understand that. So, hot takes. So we talked about Amy's short speech that foreshadows Barbie. My first question is, why do we continue to remake this story in movies? I can see why actresses love it. They're great roles for them. They're meaty characters, but the story itself is just so boring. So that's one hot take. And I really, really don't like the mother. And I never have. I've seen this. I don't think I've seen Katharine Hepburn version, but I know I have seen an older one. I think it was the Elizabeth Taylor version. She gives away their breakfast. She tells Jo, don't let the sun go down on your anger after Amy burns Jo's novel. And I'm sorry, but she had reason to be mad. She acts like she's a fucking saint, excuse my language.
Yeah.
And everybody sees her that way, but she's not. Even Beth says, do what Marmee does, do it for someone else. He's telling Jo to do her writing for somebody else. And Marmee needs for everyone to like her, but I think she's ridiculous. She has this self-sacrificial sense of duty that it's harmful to the family. You know, first of all, she's not in the scenes where she should be. There was something you mentioned a minute ago where somebody is advising Jo or advising Amy. Why isn't Meg. When Meg is getting ready to go off to the dance, why doesn't her mother advise her? Where is Marmee anyway? She's never around.
Where is Marmee when Amy burns Jo's manuscript? Like, she also should have seen how upset Amy was and talked to her about it, and she just didn't.
She's off taking care of other people instead of her own children. She's determined to be a martyr and to make her daughters into martyrs, and Beth follows in her mother's self-sacrificial shoes and goes to take care of this family, not knowing they have scarlet fever. She gets sick. It affects her heart, and she dies really young. There is a direct connection between their mother's sense of duty and self-righteous, self-sacrificial approach to life and her daughter's young death. That pisses me off. As a mother, your first responsibility is to your children, not to other families. It's okay to take care of other people when you can, but you don't set your own children aside and go off and take care of other people's children. It's wrong.
It also kind of feels like every time she helps that family, it feels like she's addressing the symptoms and not the disease. I almost wondered at a certain point, wouldn't it have been easier on all of them if she had just had that family move in with them? They might have only gotten sick because they're living in like a shack where you can see spaces between the slats in the walls. That's basically like living in a tent. They have no insulation. It's great that you bring them breakfast, but like, you know that breakfast is going to be cold in 2 seconds and they're not going to have a way to heat it up and they're going to be freezing while they eat it. It feels like everything she does is at best a half measure.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think both the mother and Jo feel a sense of duty for other people, but actually the difference in them is that Marmee, however, I gotta hate that name too. It's just so so disgusting. But and she even says to somebody walking in the door that she doesn't know, "Oh, call me Marmee." Everybody does. Really? You want this strange person to call you the same thing your children call you? That's weird. Anyway, but she does things out of a sense of duty, and I think Jo does things for other people out of love. I think her decisions when she comes back to take care of her sister, all of that is because she really has a strong love for her family. She has the mother's love that Marmee doesn't seem to have. That's my take on it. And she's determined. It's that scrapper. I think I like Jo because of her determination. She doesn't believe in God's will. She believes in her own will.
In her own.
Yeah. And I love that. I love that about her, and I relate to it. So that's all I got.
All right, yeah. Oh, wait, you asked a question. We didn't answer it. Why do we keep remaking this story? I mean, I think a lot of people do love it, but I think it's also just two things. First of all, we love a remake. We keep remaking, there's a number of classics that we keep remaking. I think it's always going to be a safe bet from a Hollywood studio perspective to do a remake because there's a built-in audience. We already know that producing another version of this story is going to get butts in seats because for whatever reason, people love to see a remake. We like to revisit stories that we already know. And I think this one is a prime example of that because the reason we like to revisit stories that we already know is that it's comforting. And I think this story is meant to be a comforting story. Even though Beth dies, I think this story is written to be a nice story about nice people. It's comforting and it's a comfort food kind of story. And I think that's a big part of its appeal. And that's also probably why it's not that appealing to me.
Yeah.
It's not my kind of
Same
comfort
here.
story. And I think also this one in particular gets a lot of remakes because there aren't nearly as many classics about women as there are about men.
I think that's it. And there's 4 characters in it. And we love the interplay.
Yes.
They're not whores. They're not. I mean, that's a lot of time when you get good female characters. In the history of movies, a lot of times they're the whores in the Western, or they're.
Oh, you mean like literal?
Yeah, I mean, like the characters are more wholesome. Not my favorite story ever. Not my favorite. I will never watch another version of this. I don't care who makes it. It's just not going to happen. It's not an interesting story to me. The characters fail me over and over again, and I just don't love it. The movie was okay. The movie was okay, except for her flashing back and forth. Those structural problems were a problem for me.
But I do think that Greta Gerwig made this story as interesting as she could.
Yeah, and she did definitely give it a feminist perspective. So that, dear listeners, is all for today.
Yes. I'm Tessa Dare. You can find me at my website, tessadare.com. That's TESSADAIR.com, where you can sign up for my email list, or you can follow me on Instagram or Threads at author.tess.adair. And you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/whereyoulead.
And I'm Beth Von Barron. You can follow me on Instagram at STL_writer_Beth, or sign up for my weekly Substack email, Saturday Morning Musings, at stlwriterbeth.substack.com. This has been Women in Harrods Sears, a discussion podcast about women and movies from the perspective of a mother and daughter who sometimes quarrel over these things, as we did in this one. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll tune in for our next episode in 2 weeks. See you then.